Hello, and welcome to a recording of our webinar entitled Preparing for Classroom-Based Assessment 1 in Visual Art. This is the second webinar in our series of webinars. You will find the first one entitled Introduction to the Visual Art Specification on our website, jct.ie. My name is Gemma Tierney, and I am a Visual Art Advisor based in Cork. I am joined by my colleague Ruth Kennington, who is a Visual Art Advisor based in Dublin. During the live version of this webinar, we conducted a number of polls. The first question we asked was, what aspect of CBA 1 in visual art would you like to know more about? And below you can see that planning was top, closely followed by the SLAR process. Here is our website. On our website, you will find all of our key documents, workshop PowerPoints, and accompanying resources from all of our previous workshops, suggested planning templates, sample planning videos using a learning outcomes approach, news and information, webinars, screencasts, and artist videos. We do update this website regularly, and you will find a recording of this webinar there in the coming days. Our key documents are located here, and they are the Framework for Junior Cycle 2015, our Junior Cycle Visual Art Specification, and our Visual Art Assessment Guidelines. Please note, our assessment guidelines for visual art have been updated, and the second edition was published on the 11th of November 2018. The learning intention for tonight's webinar is to deepen our understanding of the structure of Classroom-Based Assessment 1 in visual art. We have a lot of information to address in this webinar, and some will be relevant information you may be familiar with from our cluster days, but it is important to revisit to frame this webinar. Again, to note, this is the second webinar in our series of webinars, and we are specifically focusing on Classroom-Based Assessment 1. We will split the content up with pauses to answer your most commonly asked questions relating to CBA 1. On the evening, in the handout section of the webinar, you could have found documents on useful terminology. You will find this folder with those documents beside the webinar on our website. One of the key features of Junior Cycle is the dual approach to assessment. It is formative in that it supports teaching and learning and allows us to give feedback both during and after the process. It is summative in that we award descriptors based on the features of quality. Classroom-based assessments are best described as the occasions when the teacher assesses the student's work using the specific tasks set out in the subject specification. In CBA 1 for visual art, the specific task facilitates students to engage with a visual artistic process, and this is called from process to realisation. So what is the purpose of a classroom-based assessment? Classroom-based assessments will provide students with opportunities to demonstrate their understanding and skills in a way which would not be possible in a formal examination. A particular purpose of the classroom-based assessments will be to facilitate developmental feedback to students during their engagement and at the end of the process. Building on the previous slide, please take a moment to read this quote. Feedback is a crucial step in classroom-based assessments. Providing feedback on strengths and areas where students could improve is essential to support ongoing student learning. The most significant change in the new junior cycle is in the area of assessment. There is a substantial body of research evidence to show that educational outcomes for students can be improved by broadening our approaches to assessment. In visual art, we now have the opportunity to design rich learning experiences that may not have been possible in the Junior Certificate Art, Craft and Design syllabus. For example, we might now consider facilitating students to explore their learning through digital media, or to experiment in contemporary art practices, such as constructing site-specific installations as part of a group. There is also a recognition that no single assessment event can provide evidence of the full range of student achievement. All assessment in junior cycle, formative or summative, moment in time or ongoing, SEC, NCCA, or teacher designed, should have at its primary purpose the support of student learning. Now we will guide you through Classroom-Based Assessment 1 in Visual Art. The information we will be focusing on has been summarised for you in a glance sheet that you will find in the folder accompanying this webinar. You might find it useful to download and refer to after this presentation. Our first classroom-based assessment is called From Process to Realisation. This CBA gives students an opportunity to experience an approach that reflects that of a practicing artist, craftsperson, or designer. It allows the students to experience an organic artistic process. You will be familiar with this timeline from our CPD days, which gives an overview of the 3 years of junior cycle visual art. Our specification outlines 45 learning outcomes that support student learning and are to be developed throughout the 3 years. During first year and the first half of second year, we, with our students, will select learning outcomes to design rich learning experiences or projects suitable for their age and stage. There are 2 classroom-based assessments in visual art. They are assessed at a common level. They relate to specified learning outcomes and are scheduled to be undertaken by students within class contact time to a national timetable as stipulated by the NCCA. Here is a close-up of second year. At the beginning of the year, as with first year, your art department will agree on the most relevant learning outcomes for your students. You will be designing units of learning. A unit can be as short or as long as you like. A CBA is another unit of learning. From January the 7th, 2019, the window for CBA 1 in visual art will open. If you decide to finish the CBA early, then you can design another unit of learning as normal. As art teachers, we have the freedom with our students to decide the start date, finish date, and duration of CBA 1 during the dates indicated. Please note, Circular 0079/2018 was issued on the 22nd of November 2018. The time frame for all classroom-based assessments has been broadened. Schools can follow the original dates or avail of the flexibility of the broader windows provided. The revised dates are on your screen now. We will now take a short break from this presentation to answer any questions you may have, particularly around the context of classroom-based assessments we have just viewed. So I'm going to hand you over to Ruth now.
Thank you, Gemma. And the first round of questions in this first section are all related to the timing or the timeframe window of CBA 1. So the first question is, can my students start their CBA 1 in February? So yes, you can start your CBA 1 in February. As the teacher, you have the freedom with your students to decide the start date, the finish date, and the duration of CBA 1 within the dates indicated by the NCCA. And just to reiterate what Gemma has just said, that the recent circular has outlined that the window for CBA 1 has been broadened, and this is referenced in the circular letter 0079/2018. And the second question, my students have tasters all the way through first year. How will they be ready for the CBA in second year? Okay, so it's important to remember that classroom-based assessments are part of teaching and learning, and you will be teaching and working with your students throughout the CBA process. The student learning experience is developmental in that it is not a rehearsal or a trial run for a later examination or assessment, that the learning outcomes may be engaged with at different levels and depths, and this of course will depend on the age and stage and the ability of your students in your class. It may be the case that you are engaging with some of the learning outcomes for the very first time. So what happens if my students are absent during the CBA? Okay, so as we have mentioned already, classroom-based assessment 1 is undertaken within a time frame or window as indicated by the NCCA. And as the teacher, you have the professional autonomy to decide how long the CBA will be within the time frame. It might be important then when planning for your students' CBA to build in extra time to allow for absenteeism or other school activities that might occur during the time frame of your CBA. If you have built-in flexibility, this will allow for any student who may have been absent for a period or for those who work at a different pace. Whatever systems or procedures your school currently has in place around student absenteeism during examinations would also remain in place. And finally, the final question here is, are my students at a disadvantage if they start the CBA 1 later than another school? So your students should not be at a disadvantage if they start at a later date within reasonable time. The classroom-based assessments allow for a varied and a differentiated approach, and this is reflected in the features of quality. What I mean by this is that the features of quality outline the success criteria that are central to the student's work. And this refers to the fabric of content itself, not the quantity in terms of time or amount of work produced. And Gemma, that is the final question in section 1 of the question. So I'll pass back to yourself there.
That's great. Thanks a million, Ruth. Now we will take you through the steps that you might consider before embarking on the CBA 1 with your students. All of the key information for this webinar has been taken from the Junior Cycle Visual Art Assessment Guidelines, which are available on curriculumonline.ie, and there is also a link on our website, jct.ie also. It is important to be familiar with these, as they also detail the student experience and journey through CBA 1. In January, the NCCA will issue 3 themes. Calendar dates for these themes will change annually, depending on when we are back to school. The 3 themes will be issued online only, and they will not be posted to schools. All of the requirements for classroom-based assessments are already detailed in the Visual Art Assessment Guidelines. You can find the themes on curriculumonline.ie under Visual Art. It might be useful for your art department to look at and review the examples of work which will be available on curriculumonline.ie and consider discussing these as an art department. So where do we begin? As with all of the work we undertake with our students in Junior Cycle, we begin with the learning outcomes. You will have received an A2 learning outcome poster in our workshops. It is also available online. The process of planning for classroom-based assessments should be viewed as part of ongoing teaching and learning, and not solely for assessment purposes. It is envisioned that teachers will guide, support, and supervise students throughout the process. Therefore, when planning for a CBA, you will use whatever format you normally find helpful. There is a sample planning template on our website, jct.ie Visual Art, under the Planning section. There are also screencasts on our website that outline a number of different approaches to planning using learning outcomes. These screencasts are suggested approaches only, as you may plan in whatever format you normally prefer. Remember, learning outcomes are statements in curriculum specifications to describe the knowledge, understanding, skills, and values students should be able to demonstrate after a period of learning. The 3 strands for visual art are art, craft, and design, and are highlighted across the top of the poster. And along the side, you can see the 5 elements that we looked at in our previous webinar. All of the learning outcomes are grouped by both the strand and the element. There are key learning outcomes that support CBA 1, and these are related to the features of quality which we will use to assess our student work. These are not new learning outcomes, but have been taken from the 45 learning outcomes set out in our specification. Remember, we will always design learning experiences or projects beginning with learning outcomes, which provides us with a variety of opportunities and possibilities to best suit our students and context. You will find a copy of these learning outcomes in the webinar folder along with this webinar. When we are planning for classroom-based assessments, we might consider integrating learning outcomes from across the elements and strands to create rich learning experiences or projects. That is to say, we can plan using learning outcomes from CBAs from across the strands and elements. Here's an example of an approach you might take, selecting learning outcomes from across the 3 strands. Here is an example of another approach you might take, selecting learning outcomes from 1 strand. You can select the learning outcomes to suit your own students and your own context. It is essential, however, that you include all 5 elements, as these not only align with aspects of the features of quality, but also support the students' engagement with the artistic process. In CBA 1, from process to realisation, students will realise 1 artefact. There is no discipline list. You have the freedom to interpret the learning outcomes to develop a classroom-based assessment to suit your own students and context. It is important to note, students must realise a minimum of 1 artefact in 3 dimensions in either CBA 1 in Year 2 or for the State Certified Examination or Final Assessment in Year 3. However, students can realise more than 1 3-dimensional piece across the 2 years. It is important to consider when you might aim to participate in a SLAR meeting at the outset of CBA 1. Most schools have 1 art teacher, but there are also some schools with more than 1 art teacher. It is important to address the subject learning and assessment review meetings with these contexts in mind. Please note, we look at the SLAR process in much more detail during our upcoming CPD days. In a school with more than 1 art teacher, it is recommended that the teachers involved discuss the assessment with colleagues and plan teaching and learning. It will be important to set the times and dates for carrying out the assessment as early as possible. It is recommended that a date for the subject learning and assessment review is established at the outset to assist in the planning, implementation, and reviewing of the classroom-based assessment. Once the school has decided this date, teachers and students can prepare for the completion of the From Process to Realisation CBA. The timing of the process may vary from school to school. In a school with one art teacher, it is recommended that the teacher discuss the assessment arrangements with their school facilitator or management with a view to contacting and coordinating with teachers from nearby schools. The teacher can then plan any teaching and learning that may be required, and along with their colleagues from nearby schools, agree a date for a subject, learning and assessment review meeting. It is important to agree the times and dates for carrying out the assessment as early as possible and notify all school management teams of these dates. Where possible, one school should host the subject learning and assessment review meeting, with this school also supplying the facilitator. If a school is used, the location of the meeting should rotate between all schools involved for each successive year. Once the date has been decided, teachers and students can prepare for the completion of the From Process to Realisation classroom-based assessment. Please note the latest date for completion of the Subject Learning and Assessment Review meeting for this year is the 27th of May 2019. It is important that when teachers are designing a unit of learning for the CBA, that the age and stage of students is considered. Remember, CBAs are capturing a short period of student learning. CBAs are not a rehearsal for third year. When deciding the amount of time that a CBA 1 might take, it is important to factor in matches, illness, and other school-related activities that will occur. Build flexibility into your planning. Classroom-based assessment in visual art are a part of teaching and learning. Therefore, throughout the CBA, we would plan and teach as we normally do, assign homework where appropriate, and give feedback we normally would within our school contexts. And there is also a recognition that no single assessment event can provide evidence of the full range of student achievement. There are 4 level descriptors of achievement in each classroom-based assessment. They are yet to meet expectations, in line with expectations, above expectations, and exceptional. These are universal across all subjects, and your students may be quite familiar with them already. It is really important that teachers are familiar with the features of quality for classroom-based assessment 1. Students should also be familiar with them, and you may choose to break them down so that your students can understand them. Please note, the features of quality for CBA 1 are available in the 2nd edition of the Junior Cycle Visual Art Assessment Guidelines, published on the 11th of November 2018. You can access the updated assessment guidelines on curriculumonline.ie and on jct.ie. You will also receive a copy of the updated features of quality during our cluster days. At our department planning meetings, we should look closely at and discuss the features of quality to help us form a shared understanding of what the language means. These discussions will also help us to develop rich learning classroom-based assessments for our students. Please take a moment to consider the language in the feature of quality for in line with expectations. We'll now take a short break from our presentation to answer any questions you might have, particularly around the context of the classroom-based assessments we have just viewed. So I'm going to pass you over to Ruth again.
Thank you, Gemma. Okay, so the questions in this section here, the second question section, are going to focus really on the area of planning and preparing for classroom-based assessment 1. So the first question, will students work from the same themes in CBA 1 and CBA 2? So no, there will be different themes issued for CBA 1 and CBA 2. Now it is worth noting that the themes for classroom-based assessment 1 will change annually and will be published in early January by the NCCA on www.curriculumonline.ie. And just to reiterate what Gemma said, these will not be posted to schools. And the second question we have here is, what documentation do we need around planning? That we prefer to draw and write up our plans, and is this going to be okay? Absolutely. Art departments have the freedom to devise their own planning templates, and these can be physically produced, they could be visual representations, they could be handwritten, or they could be typed out. They also can be digital and shared as such, or you could also use your own school-based template if that suits you. Remember, you're planning for yourself and your students, so finding a way that works for you is very important. You will also need to begin with the learning outcomes and consider what you want your students to learn, rather than beginning with the discipline or the realisation and beginning from there. Your planning, whether it's in your department or your individual planning, will therefore follow on from an understanding of and a confidence in using a learning outcomes approach. And successful planning will align teaching strategies and assessment methodologies with the learning outcomes as set out in our visual arts specification. And as Gemma mentioned there, we have a range of planning screencasts in the planning section of our website that you may find useful. And we would also be advising that you familiarise yourself with the visual arts specification and the newly revised visual art assessment guidelines for classroom-based assessments. And finally, we have a question here that we are often asked, and it is, I'm interested in using the learning outcome 1.4 in my planning for CBA 1. Do I need to specifically focus on the human figure here in CBA 1 or every time that I work with this learning outcome? Okay, so the short answer here is no, that you might decide to work on a particular part of the learning outcome. That the full learning outcome does not need to be completed every time it is engaged with or developed with your students. So in this example of learning outcome 1.4, which states, demonstrate how they use drawing to observe, record and analyse the human figure and the world around them. So we could consider breaking this up to focus on a particular aspect, depending of course on the age and the stage that your students are at any given time. And we must remember that the full range of learning outcomes, and that's the 15 in art, the 15 in craft, and the 15 in design, will be developed with your students over the 3 years. That they're not constrained and learning outcomes, so therefore they can be revisited at a later date. And that's the final question just in this section 2, Gemma, so I'll pass back to you there.
Thanks a million, Ruth. Now we will take you through the steps to consider during the classroom-based assessment. As we mentioned earlier, CBA 1 gives students an opportunity to experience an approach that reflects that of a practicing artist, craftsperson or designer. It allows the students to experience an organic artistic process. The process wheel poster distributed in last year's workshop may support you and your students. During the live webinar, we asked participants what aspect of the visual artistic process might your students need more support in. The responses are highlighted on the screen. It is possible for students to complete this first classroom-based assessment either individually or as part of a group. If students choose to work in a group, it is important that the group be kept to a manageable size, 3 students at most, so that each student can make a meaningful contribution and to better facilitate the distribution of work and the sharing of responsibilities. For group work, all tasks that are distributed between students need to be both equitable and meaningful to facilitate the work students will engage in. They must also enable contributions from each student in individual sketchpads so that, when the work is being assessed, the students have been able to meet the criteria as set out in the features of quality. There is more information on group work for classroom-based assessments in the Visual Art Assessment Guidelines. Students will continue to document their processes in their visual art sketchpads, which can be in physical and in digital format, or a combination of the two. The sketchpad is used to capture their ideas, creativity, experiments and explorations, and even their realised work. As part of Classroom-Based Assessment 1, students will choose their initial theme and appropriate primary sources. They will research and explore their ideas. They may consider the visual art strand through which they will primarily generate their realised work. They will further develop their ideas. They could record all work and annotations in their visual art sketchpad. They will be incorporating the 5 elements of visual art throughout their work. They will complete their realised work, and throughout they will reflect on their decisions, processes and realised work. The best way to prepare for CBA 1 is to engage students in rich learning experiences from first year onwards. The CBAs allow us to develop student choice and student voice. As we said earlier, CBAs should reflect as much as possible normal classroom practice. And as per normal, we support students with ongoing feedback. I'm going to pass you over to Ruth now for more questions around the area that we have just looked at.
Thanks very much, Gemma. So the questions here in our section 3 are all related to students working during the classroom-based assessments with some reference to the Visual Arts Sketchpad. So our first question is, can the same sketchpad be used for CBA and for classwork? So yes, absolutely. The classroom-based assessment, it's exactly that. It is classwork or class learning, and the assessment of it is a snapshot of that learning that is reported on the Junior Cycle Profile of Achievement, or the JCPA. So students can continue working in the sketchpad they have begun working in previously and continue in the same way during the classroom-based assessment. We could also remind ourselves at this point of what the specification says about the Visual Arts Sketchpad, that it can take a number of formats and that it is essentially a way of documenting student learning. Our teachers, in collaboration with students, are free to choose their own format suitable to their own classroom context. Teachers and students have the freedom to decide the size, the format and the number of visual art sketchpads, and whether they're going to use a physical or digital or a combination of both. And the second question, can students bring the sketchpad home? And what happens if they lose a sketchpad? So you are free to decide how you will organise your own homework systems and procedures in your classroom during the classroom-based assessment. And whatever systems your school currently has in place for lost or misplaced work would remain in place. And another question we have is, should a student have an individual sketchpad if they're working in a group during the CBA? So yes, this is a very important point that we wanted to clarify, that it is a requirement that students working in a group during the classroom-based assessment would have their own individual sketchpad. So this will enable contributions from each student so that the work when the work is being assessed, that the students would have had the opportunity to show evidence that they have engaged with and will be able to meet the criteria as set out in the features of quality. Artwork in the student's own visual art sketchpad should be the student's own original personal response. Should work then be dated in the visual art sketchpad? Yes, it will be very helpful for students to date their work, so as they work, as well as when they're reviewing and reflecting on their learning journey throughout the process. And the final question here is another question that we get asked quite often. And is there going to be a discipline list provided, as I'm a little confused about the 3 strands and what can be realised in each? So as Gemma pointed out there, there is no list of disciplines, that you as the teacher has the professional autonomy to interpret the learning outcomes to develop a classroom-based assessment that suits your own students and your own school context. And remember, as we said earlier, that we will always begin with the learning outcomes. Then we will identify what we want the students to learn. And a closer look at the definitions above the learning outcomes in art, craft and design will help to clarify the different emphasis in the 3 strands. So that's the final question we have here in the 3rd check-in point, Gemma. So I'll just pass back to yourself.
Thanks a million, Ruth. So we're just continuing on now, and we're going to look at what might happen after classroom-based assessment 1. So who assesses classroom-based assessments? Classroom-based assessments are assessed by the students' teachers, and they are reported on to students and parents or guardians during junior cycle and in the junior cycle profile of achievement. When students have completed classroom-based assessment 1, it is good to remember to leave enough time to use the features of quality to provisionally award a descriptor to their work. The 4 descriptors that may be awarded are yet to meet expectations, in line with expectations, above expectations, and exceptional. When using the features of quality to assess the level of student achievement in a classroom-based assessment, teachers use an on-balance judgment. The teacher should read the feature of quality, starting with yet to meet expectations, until they reach a descriptor that best describes the work being assessed. We demonstrate how to look at this in our upcoming cluster workshops. It might be useful for your art department to look at and review the examples of work which will be available soon on curriculumonline.ie and consider discussing these as an art department. In preparation for the subject learning and assessment review meeting, each teacher will identify 1 sample of students' work for each descriptor, where feasible, and will have these available for discussion at the SLAR meeting. We will bring the work to our SLAR meeting. So what exactly is a subject learning and assessment review meeting? The purpose of the SLAR is twofold. Firstly, it serves as an opportunity to review how we assessed student work and to ensure that the work was assessed in line with national standards. However, the SLAR also offers a meaningful opportunity to learn from and with our colleagues to develop a professional culture that values learning conversations and to build our own confidence about our judgments of student work and to share ideas and strategies that we have used in our teaching. It is a rich professional development opportunity. The SLAR will help us not just to consider how we assess student work, but the quality of feedback that we give to students to help them improve the work themselves. The time for review meetings will be provided for in the school calendar from the allocated 22 hours of professional time for each full-time teacher for each year. Each meeting will be subject-specific, 2 hours long. It will take place as near as possible to the completion of the classroom-based assessment, involve the review of student work related to a specific classroom-based assessment. Following the subject learning and assessment review meeting, each individual teacher will reflect on the judgment they had made for their students' work, based on the outcomes from the meeting, and where necessary, will make the appropriate judgments to the level of achievement. Students will be informed of the descriptor they have been awarded once the subject learning and assessment review meeting has taken place. Although students will be reflecting throughout the process, it is important to allow time at the end also. Remember, providing effective feedback is a crucial step in using the classroom-based assessment 1 to support learning in visual art. We will discuss in detail the SLAR process in our upcoming cluster workshops and will provide further supports on our website in due course. We have been getting lots of questions in about how schools might report on ongoing assessments outside of the CBA 1. The 3 boxes on your screen indicate some of the terminology that can be used in reporting progress and achievement to parents and students as part of the school's reporting procedures and through the junior cycle profile of achievement. It is useful to note that the language for classroom-based assessments, which are the descriptors, are only used for classroom-based assessments. If a school decides to include the results of in-house examinations, then these results should be expressed in the terminology used by the State Examinations Commission for the terminal examination. In the school report, it is important that the language used to describe performance in school examinations is kept separate from the language used to describe ongoing classroom-based assessments. Schools may find the ongoing reporting guidelines published by the NCCA useful in this regard. Our final poll that we launched on the evening was to assess which area of the JCT Visual Art website did participants find most helpful. On our website, you will find all of our key documents, PowerPoints, and accompanying resources from all of our previous workshops, as well as suggested planning templates, sample planning videos using a learning outcome approach, news and information, and webinars, screencasts, and artist videos. As we said earlier, we update this website regularly, and you will find a recording of the webinar there in the coming days. So I'm going to pass you over to Ruth again for our final check-in to sum up some of the other questions that we have been getting in.
Thank you, Gemma. And the questions we have in our final check-in point are all related to what needs to happen after the classroom-based assessment. So our first question is, how long do we need to store the CBA work after the CBA has been completed? So once the SLAR meeting has been completed and the provisional descriptors have been reviewed and the final descriptors have been awarded to the students, the work can then be given back to the student and does not need to be stored after that. And our second question, do I have to give written feedback to my students after their CBA, and is there a particular form or format for this? Okay, so providing effective feedback is a crucial step in classroom-based assessments to support learning in visual art. Now, it will be most beneficial for students if they have been informed of the descriptor that they've been awarded once the subject learning and assessment review meeting has taken place and its outcomes have been processed. However, effective feedback would go beyond the naming of the descriptor awarded, and so feedback on the strengths of the student work and on the possible areas for improvement can be used to support their further or future learning going forward. And if you're interested in more information on feedback, it can be found in the Focus on Learning formative feedback document, which is one of a 4-part series published by the NCCA to support teachers in formative assessment. And we have our third question here is, will there be sample examples of classroom-based assessments that we can review? So the NCCA are currently working with teachers of visual art to gather samples of CBA1 from process to realisation, and these will be made available as a resource for teachers on www.curriculumonline.ie on the website there. And another question we have here is around how much work do we need to bring to a SLAR? This is a question that we get asked a lot. So in preparation for the subject learning and assessment review meeting, each teacher will identify one sample of students' work for each descriptor, where feasible, and will have these available for discussion at the meeting. It is important to note that we look at the SLAR meeting at length in our upcoming CPD workshop, where teachers will be able to ask focused questions at various points during the workshop. And we have a related question here, really, and it is related to the SLAR experience also. And it is, I am the only art teacher in my school, and how do I go about making arrangements for the SLAR meeting after CBA1? So as you're aware, classroom-based assessment 1 is undertaken within the timeframe that as indicated by the NCCA. So in a school with one art teacher, it would be recommended that the teacher discuss the assessment arrangements with their school facilitator and management with a view to contacting and coordinating with teachers from nearby schools. So schools have the autonomy here to organise the SLAR meeting that best suits their own context, their location and their setting. So when contact had been made or has been made with another school, it would be important to agree that the dates and the times for carrying out the assessment as early as possible, and to notify all parties involved, the school management teams, of the dates that have been decided. And it is recommended that a date for the subject learning and assessment review that is due to follow the CBA is established at the outset to assist in the planning and the implementation and reviewing of the classroom-based assessment experience. And we have a final question here that's, I suppose, related to this, and it's, can you tell me about the role of the facilitator? So teachers will fulfil the role of facilitator during the subject learning and assessment review meeting on a rotational basis. So this would be important. It would be important to have a conversation about this before the commencement of your CBA1 with the hope of establishing this position. And it is important to note, as we mentioned there earlier, that we do look at the role of the facilitator in our upcoming CPD workshops. But in addition to this, Junior Cycle for Teachers will also be providing elective workshops focusing on the role of the facilitator in the SLAR meeting process. And further information, I suppose, on the SLAR process can also be found in the Junior Cycle Assessment and Reporting section on www.ncca.ie. So you'll be able to have a look at further information there. So that actually is the final question that we have in this question section. We hope that you found them to be helpful and that they'll help you going forward in your planning and preparation for classroom-based assessment 1. And with that, I will hand you back over to Gemma.
That's great. Thanks again for those, Ruth. Here are the details of our upcoming cluster days. As you can see, we are in 2018-19, and the focus of this day will be on student reflection in visual art, on preparing our students for CBA1, and we'll also be discussing CBA2 and the SEC examination part in third year. The subject-specific day you will engage in over the next 2 years will be informed by your needs and your feedback. We also have recorded versions of our webinars. We have Arts and Junior Cycle elective workshops and many more resources on our website jct.ie to support you. Just a quick reminder, please ensure your principal or the teacher with management resource hours registers you for the cluster workshops this year and each subsequent year. Also make sure you are following us on Twitter, JCT Visual Art, for updates, news and information. And finally, thank you for joining us in this recorded version of the webinar. Thank you to the colleagues presenting with me this evening and answering your questions. and to all of our associates for the hard work that they undertake throughout the year in preparation for the workshops.